When a large news event is breathlessly covered by the media, the two questions we should be asking ourselves are, what else is not being covered, and what is the federal government doing? While the country has been preoccupied with the death of Jeffrey Epstein, the federal government set a spending record. They've spent more in the last 10 months than they ever have in the same 10-month period. We'll discuss this alarming fact and provide a lasting solution to the debt and deficits this country continuously racks up year after year in this episode of Analysis Behind the News, where we provide the perspective that you can use to help save American liberty and independence. According to CNS News, the federal government spent a record $3.7 trillion in the first 10 months of its fiscal year, which is October through July. The alarming thing is that the government did not even have that much to spend. The article goes on to state that the government ran a deficit of nearly $900 billion. Unfortunately, Americans are no longer shocked at these big irresponsible numbers. So let's place a little perspective on this. Some of the most wasteful spending Congress has ever done occurred in 2009 when it bailed out big banks and followed that up with stimulating the economy. Remember the billions that went into shovel-ready projects? And shovel-ready pretty much described that instance, since it was akin to digging a hole in the ground and dumping pallets of money into it. Anyway, the article points to the Treasury as having spent today's equivalent of nearly $3.6 trillion in the first 10 months of fiscal year 2009. But before you point fingers at the Obama administration for their shovel-ready portion of it, let's not forget that President George W. Bush signed the bill bailing out the banks, so there's plenty of irresponsibility from both sides of that political aisle. But think about that. This spending record has outspent a time in our nation's history when the population was duped into thinking that the economy was going down the tubes and that we needed to spend our way back to prosperity. So, 10 years later, what's the excuse for this spending record? It's still Congress's inability and irresponsibility to act. Now, some people will say all we need to do is have a balanced budget amendment and that'll take care of the problem, right? Wrong. It sounds good until you look at how it would be implemented, and you soon will see loopholes big enough that cancel out its effectiveness. For instance, Congress plays games with spending by employing a whole host of tools and accounting tricks to mask its true spending habits. An example of this is classifying spending into mandatory and discretionary spending. 64% of the federal budget is mandatory spending that Congress has basically set up on an autopilot. Money in this category is spent without their annual overview and includes entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, food stamps, programs for veterans, and wages for Congress and the President. Discretionary spending is spending that Congress needs to authorize each and every year. Would a balanced budget amendment force Congress to be responsible to go back to overseeing annual reviews of all spending? Well, don't hold your breath, because if we can agree that Congress is not following the Constitution as written, then why would they start to follow a new amendment? They would at least find ways around it. And one of those ways is actually providing an exemption for national emergencies. Many of these proposed amendments offer a way out from the spending limitations during times of a national emergency. Now, can you think of a time when America did not have such an emergency, considering how we have been in endless wars for decades? Plus, amendments do not take into consideration the recklessly independent Federal Reserve. The Fed has been responsible for devaluating the American dollar by about 98% by inflating the money supply since its inception in 1913. An audit in 2010 revealed that up to $10 trillion was sent from the Federal Reserve to bail out foreign banks and corporations. proposed balanced budget amendments do not take this wild card into consideration. And there are many other flaws with the proposed balanced budget amendment, including permitting Congress to ignore the balanced budget requirement if both houses pass the budget by 60%. And that's a very low bar for ignoring a balanced budget amendment. But the overall residing fact is that the amendment would not address the real problem of government ignoring the Constitution and spending money in areas that it has no constitutional authority to do so. It has merely built up a precedence by which it has not been challenged by its checks and balances. And we could argue that if the Constitution were obeyed as the founders intended, that the federal government would be slashed by 80% its cost and 80% its size. A multitude of federal agencies would be axed and liberty would be partially restored. A lesson here is that the government cannot be controlled by creating more government or more rules that it can ignore. The solution is to get officials to follow the existing rules. And of course, the big question is, well, yeah, great, sounds good. How do we do that? We do that by utilizing the tools that are housed in Article 6, namely by forcing them to honor their oath of office. The Constitution states that every state and federal official is to essentially obey the Constitution and the laws that are passed in support of it. States can nullify unconstitutional measures and stop participating in the Fed's never-ending trough of dollars. This won't happen overnight, as we all know, and it won't happen with just individual efforts. But it can happen with a coordinated effort across the country. The John Birch Society has many solutions that would rein in spending, including a return to sound money. And we can't rely on the efforts of politicians. Recall that we had a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican President for 2 years, but very little effort was made to rein in spending. Instead, Congress has often resorted to passing continuing spending resolutions that temporarily extend the current amount of spending. They basically place the entire budget on autopilot and assume the money will always be there. A balanced budget amendment won't solve the problem, but we the people can. Learn more about balanced budget amendments by watching 2 short videos we've produced, and then read an article that we've published a few years ago, and then take action by applying for membership at JBS. All links are in the description, and please be sure to like and share this video as well as subscribe. And until next time, we'll see you then.